Zizi Papacharissi is professor and head of the communication department and also professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and university scholar at the University of Illinois System. Her work focuses on the social and political consequences of online media. She's published 10 books, over 70 journal articles and book chapters, and serves on the editorial board of 15 different journals. Zizi is the founding and current editor of the open access journal Social Media and Society. She's collaborated with Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and Oculus, and has participated in closed consultations with the Obama 2012 election campaign. She sits on the Committee of the Health and Well-Being of Young Adults, funded by the National Academics of Science, the National Research Council, and the Institute of Medicine in the US, and has been invited to lecture about her work on social media in several universities and research institutes in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Her work has been translated in Greek, German, Korean, Chinese, Hungarian, Italian, Turkish, and Persian. Her latest book, and the one that I just mentioned a moment ago, forms the basis of this lecture, After Democracy. I'd highly recommend it. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, do pick it up. Without further ado, please join me in giving a big UNE welcome to Zizi Papacharissi.
Thank you. Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's a special pleasure because it's my first time visiting Portland, Maine, and it's also my first public non-Zoom lecture since the beginning of the pandemic. I welcome the opportunity to speak with you about this book. Thank you for doing me the honor of inviting me to visit you, and I understand some of you have read the book, so it's all the more fun for me to discuss it with an engaged audience. As mentioned, my work focuses on the social and political consequences of technology. I've been studying those for about 25 years. I'm very interested in technology, society, democracy. For some time now, I'd say for the past 10, 12 years, I've become drawn to structures of feeling, soft structures of feeling, and civic engagement, or something that in the humanities we refer to as affect and civic engagement. So I'd like to talk about that for a moment. Affect is something that lends forms of expression that emerge in democracies or in societies, democratic and non, lends expression a lot of intensity, and I think that's something that we can all relate to. So I'll talk about my previous work on social movements and feeling and emotion and social media, and then I'll lead into After Democracy. That's my way of explaining how I drew the events that I drew inspiration for After Democracy from. And then I'll talk about After Democracy, which centers on what we thought democracy was in the past, I suppose, and what we think it is now, and ways in which it might become different and stronger and less vulnerable to populism, and ways in which maybe we might, stumble upon something new, something perhaps more advanced than democracy. So let me start with a premise. It's a big day in the news today. A huge item was, of course, Facebook and the whole whistleblowing affair. So some of what I have to say is even a little bit more pertinent. I want to start with a premise, sort of the foundation behind a lot of the work that I do, the things that we know, the knowns about how technology, what sort of place it occupies in society, what sort of meaning it might have for democracy. And the first thing I want to say is that the internet or any sort of places or spaces technology sustains are not magical. They're not spaces that we dive into and we emerge out of antisocial, undemocratic. It cannot create something out of nothing. On its own, the internet cannot create democracy. It cannot also destroy democracy. What the internet does, and the many platforms that it supports, of course, is that it pluralizes, but it doesn't necessarily democratize. It can connect democratically oriented people. It can also connect fascists. Nor does it extinguish social problems on its own. It'll amplify, but not on equal terms. It offers voice. I like to say that all voices are equal online. Some voices are more equal than others. So it does not create hate speech. Humans speak words of hate. So on its own, the internet is not responsible for hate speech, but it does make hate speech more visible, more spreadable, and it affords it this element of intensity. So let me talk about this element of intensity for a little bit and explain what it means and why it's important, because as a nation, but I think as a planet, as a human race, we are living through some intense times. Intense in terms of the rhetoric that's used, but also intense in terms of the emotions that we experience. And the ways in which some of these platforms that we use work, well, they increase that intensity. They amplify and they make things more visible. And a lot of times it feels like they crank all the volume all the way up. So imagine an atmosphere or what might happen in a situation where the volume's been cranked all the way up, but then the volume button is broken, and then there's no way to turn that intensity, to dial it back down. That's my read on what we're going through now. We've been trapped in one of those situations where there's very, very loud noise. There's bias, of course, but there's very, very loud volume. And the volume button's been broken, and we're trying to repair it and slowly turn the volume down and mend the ways in which we practice civil discourse. Let me quickly define, we use this word, to talk about intensity often in the humanities, and I had to do a lot of reading up here for for some time because I'm trained in the social sciences, and affect is a word that we encounter in political science, and it's defined in one way in psychology, a different one in philosophy, yet another one, and then in neuroscience in very interesting ways as well. Affect refers to that intensity, but we often use it casually in our everyday lives. We'll talk about affective polarization, for instance, as something that drives and characterizes contemporary forms of democracy. Affect is not the same as emotion. Affect refers to the intensity with which we feel, the intensity with which we're happy, we're sad, we're angry. For example, when you start tapping your foot to a song that you like, that's an affective reaction. If you listen to the words and you don't like them, and then you turn the radio off because you hated the words, they were racist, well, that's a cognitive reaction and an emotional reaction as well. But your first tapping of the foot or bobbing of the head, that's affective. A lot of the reactions that we have to the arts, to music, are of an affective nature. In conversation, if you're just nodding along to indicate that you're following what someone is saying, but not necessarily that you're agreeing, again, that would be an affective reaction. Let me give you a different example to make things more political. Affect frequently works in gestural ways. So think of a caress to the cheek versus a slap to the face. It's the same gesture, but it's delivered with very different intensity, revealing different intention and then yielding a completely different result. Affect, you might say, that intensity is the difference between a peaceful protest, and then the Capitol insurrection, the events of January 6th. The reason why I'm interested in affect and how I kind of sort of became immersed in research on it, it's certainly not the easiest and least complex way to describe how social media work, especially when you're speaking with engineers who are designing these platforms. I became interested in it because it was the most convincing explanation for the kind of ways in which social media sets the tone for conversation. That is what affect is. It's sentiment, it's mood, it's feeling, it's atmosphere. It's the atmosphere that sets the tonality, the textures, the civic textures in which we're invited to participate, again, in societies, democratic or non, or in societies in transition. A while ago, around 2010, 2011, I became interested in Twitter, which was a very new, very different medium, much smaller. Very different conversations took place on Twitter back then. People were puzzled because we would post pictures of what we had for breakfast, and journalists would ask in interviews, why is this medium interesting? Everybody's posting, what kind of eggs they had. A much smaller medium than the Arab Spring happened. Twitter played a part there in connecting people, and the Egyptian revolution that led to the downfall of Hosni Mubarak happened as well. And a very interesting question at the time was, did social media make the revolution, or did the revolution make social media and Twitter? I would say both. Certainly social media played a part, did not make a revolution. But also, that part that they played in connecting people on such a mass scale and across the globe opened our eyes to the potential that they have to connect like-minded but also not like-minded people across very different, very divergent ideological areas. So I became interested, and we ran a number of studies on how Twitter functions then as a medium for news storytelling. We were very interested in how citizens working together on Twitter are framing events, what sort of lens, that is, they offer us for understanding and internalizing what's happening around us. There's a distinction between the event that actually happens and then the story or the different stories that are being told about that event, depending on which news medium or which platform it is that you're following. News values play a part into this because they organize that story that's being told. They're the things that turn, again, events into stories. And there's this fascinating distinction between what happens, the event, some people might call that the truth, what's real, and then the stories that we tell and come to be known about an event. And then, of course, an even more fascinating process of transition in terms of how those turn into history. Into this came this idea of premediation. It's a brilliant idea that's offered by a humanities professor called Richard Grusin, and he uses the term premediation to describe the form that events take on before they turn into stories. And he started first writing about this post 9/11 because he found that the structure of news storytelling was characterized by this obsession with instantaneity, by this obsession with understanding something and telling a story about it well before it had actually had transpired. He referred to the news scroller that emerged around that time as a prominent feature of news storytelling as an example of premediation. He made the point that premediation is very rich in affect, very rich in intensity. It sort of cultivates and reproduces, reinforces this obsession with instantaneity in news storytelling. And again, I'm bringing this all up because it very much set the stage for the work that I did in understanding the link between social media and social movements, and then the part that media are technologies as well, and mediated technologies play in democracies. And at the time I asked, this is a long line of research that I've been developing, again, over the past decade or so, on whether social media make or break movements, revolutions, and elections and democracy. And without taking you through all of the finer points of the grander argument, I made the point that a lot of the formations that we witness, that we see in contemporary societies, I would characterize as affective publics that are driven by this sort of intensity that doesn't necessarily have, or doesn't always have, some sort of like ideological resonance. I understand affective publics as networked publics that come together, are identified, or are disbanded through bonds of sentiment. So sentiment is key. And so Black Lives Matter can be an effective public. It can also grow into an ideological movement, but it can also be an effective public. MAGA is also an effective public. The Occupy movement was an effective public. These are all very different ways in which intensity can play into the ways, into the manner, into the conduits that people use to connect and to join forces, whether they're going to be able to move together or just get entrapped in this sort of standstill motion that mimics, that stands for, that provides the illusion of engagement, is a completely different story, and is something that's subject to historical, sociocultural context. But effective publics materialize uniquely and leave distinct digital footprints, and this may seem like a very commonsensical point to make, but I make it because all too often we watch a social movement attain a kind of presence online and prominence, and we assume that all movements are going to have the same kind of presence, or that all movements that have that kind of presence are similar, and that's really not the case at all. Every movement is distinct and has its own story or stories to tell, and also leaves its own distinct imprint. And so Me Too has its own story or stories, is its own movement, has its own digital imprint, very different from the imprint, the digital imprint, for instance, of anti-vax movement. Affective publics support connective, but not necessarily collective action. There's not always some sort of overarching, grand, overseeing figure that determines how these publics are going to become connected and how the story is going to be told. Which is why a lot of the narratives that emerge out of these movements can be a little bit fragmented. There's exceptions to this. When we have strong curators who are collecting, filtering content, who are correcting the information or controlling the information that's being spread, then we might have a very coherent, cohesive narrative that emerges. The Me Too movement, again, provided one such example where we had journalists who did very serious investigative work, and then we had public figures who then did the work of safeguarding the manner in which the narrative of the movement unfolded online and ensuring that it would be inoculated against attacks, counter hashtag attacks against the movement. MAGA is another interesting example. I wouldn't say necessarily that we had curators there, but we definitely had content instigators, people who injected the particular stream with different kinds of content in order to provoke particular kinds of reactions. So there's an interesting connection going there and interesting forms of action that are being spurred. I wouldn't call them collective, again. I would call them connective. They have that spontaneous, that impromptu element. They're not always containing a fully fleshed out ideological component, and they're always filled with this kind of intensity. So these kinds of publics are powered by affective statements of opinion, fact, or a blend of both, which in turn produce ambient, always-on feeds that further connect and pluralize expression in regimes, democratic and non. And I've already explained that, these publics can support different kinds of movements, that are motivated by divergent intentions. Some are friendly to democracy, some not. They typically produce disruptions, interruptions of dominant political narratives by presencing underrepresented viewpoints, marginalized viewpoints. When I was first working on this, it just so happened that the first few movements that I was analyzing were aggressively pro-democracy. But as I've moved through the work, and I'll show you some examples in the next slide, I've encountered a lot of movements that are enabled and powered by the same intensity, but have very different goals. These publics are sustained around streams that are convened around affective commonalities. And here comes the key part. The impact that these publics are going to have, these publics that are empowered, that are enabled digitally through platforms, their impact is not going to be instantaneous. It won't be immediately political, sociocultural, legislative, or economic. But it will be instantly symbolic. And I emphasize this because all too often we become entranced by the speed with which information moves in online, by that virality. And we assume that change is going to follow in an equally speedy manner. And when it does not, we become disappointed in our institutions, in our leaders, in our media, in our democracies, in ourselves. But it's not just those things that have let us down. It's also our own expectations that have misled us. Because change is gradual. Raymond Williams, the cultural studies scholar, tells us that revolutions are long, and I add, they have to be long in order to attain meaning. So to say that something has symbolic consequence, symbolic impact, is no small thing. Take again the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, which is a sentence that, interpreted literally, has a meaning, interpreted symbolically, attains a completely different level of significance, conveys a different magnitude of indignation, provides the opportunity for people to stand up and be counted, becomes much more impactful, much more important, much more dangerous to some people. The agency, and that is why often people try to take that movement down by using more literal interpretations and counterattacking that white lives matter or all lives matter. They're trying to bring up again, to take the phrase down to its literal meaning, to take away from its symbolic significance, precisely because the symbolic meaning can potentially be so impactful. The agency that these publics lay claim to is semantic. It's attained through discursive negotiation and renegotiation of key institutions of democracy. So take the defund the police movement. Obviously, we're not saying that all police officers should be laid off. That is not the point. The point that movement is making is that there needs to be a very serious conversation that examines the meaning of law enforcement in contemporary societies and in contemporary democracies, because it seems like the ways in which we enforce the law and we practice policing is dated, has a lot in common, not with our times, but rather with the medieval ages. So that's meant to invite, again, a semantic renegotiation of what policing as an institution, of what law enforcement as an institutionally enabled act means in a society. And then also take MAGA. I say in the end that the power that these publics attain is of a liminal nature, of a transitional nature. I think many of us were alarmed with the January 6th happenings because we assumed that that access to power was not transitional. It was going to have an afterlife after those crowds left the Capitol building. We were alarmed because it was taking too long for that power to just be stripped of those individuals, for law enforcement to arrive. Those of us who grew up in dictatorships, in turbulent democracies, recognized that this was a fleeting moment, remembered our collective histories, and thought, unless there is a specific link to structure, to government structures, then there's no way that this can evolve beyond the liminal. But for a moment, we were all quite concerned. Why do I bring all this up? And this is some of the previous work that starts from the very early days of, predating the Mubarak regime and the earnestness of that movement, to then how that movement unfolded and led to pathways that were not as close to a revolution as the Egyptians originally hoped it would lead, to Occupy, which again was a movement that offered a word meant to be employed as an open signifier to allow people again to stand up and be counted, rather than make a very nuanced ideological statement. That's something that the media were always looking for, but not what the movement was about. To Black Lives Matter, a movement that started out very strong, was hit by a number of #hijacking attacks in its early days, and then returned much better prepared to counter those attacks. To MAGA, a movement that was very much motivated by content injections, many of those manufactured by bots. Very little movement, much discord, a lot of intensity. To this. So following this, all of this analysis and difficult work, I got to a point where I said, let me flip the question. I'm always asking about technology and what place technology has. Let me start from the other way around. Let me ask about democracy. Let me go and talk to these people who get caught up in these moments of intensity and possible toxicity, and let me see what drives them, what motivates them, what inspires them about democracy. So this photograph is of a work by the artist and designer and sort of Renaissance man, Virgil Abloh. And it says, "You're obviously in the wrong place." A lot of times when I was working on the book in the past 5 years, and I would tell people that I was writing a book called After Democracy, they thought that was such an ominous title. I think even my editor tried to talk me into changing it, because he thought I was talking about, everybody thought that I was talking about democracy dying. And then I would explain, no, I simply want us to just sort of imagine, to look at the future with different eyes, and think that, reflect on the fact that democracy as a system has been with us for a very long time. What if there's something better out there? And technology, instead of obscuring the picture and creating a lot of intensity and a lot of noise that seems to create like a fog-like effect, what if technology can help us see better, can help us hear better, can help us discern what is out there? What if there's more than one stops to our civic journey? Maybe there's like democracy stop number 1, and we have stops 2, 3, 4, and we can use technology to build out the ways, the pathways to those stops, the same way we expanded transportation as a way of getting to know different worlds. Returning to this photograph and to the inspiration for the book, people often think that I wrote this book because I was disappointed with democracy. There are a lot of things that were pointing to polarizing effects around the world, and perhaps this is what I was interested in. That's actually not the case. I was watching a number of politicians around the world who were all characterized by an earnest drive to do things differently. But it seemed to me, in the way I was reading the situation, that they were caught up in these old, dated governmental infrastructures. They were caught up in some sort of, dream of democracy in the past, and that kept just sort of halting them. It seemed to me like these people maybe had come from the future, or they were meant to be in the present, but the present was just very, very jaded. And so why I thought that you're obviously in the wrong place, I thought that really just kind of sums up my thinking in terms of how I started thinking about the book. One of my foundational ideas is that we change, and so does our technology, but we have this tendency to cling to past iterations of democracy like this dream. We try to desperately remember after wake up. And I'm using the word dream on purpose because we never had perfect democracy, and yet we somehow cling to the idea that we did have this perfect democracy in the past. We did not. And somehow we could get back into it. So I decided this was going to be my 10th book, so I thought, well, now, if anything, I've earned the license to be a little bit crazy and unconventional. I'd been spending a lot of my time lecturing about this previous book, Affective Publics, because it described many social movements that were ongoing, and people responded to that. They wanted to understand what role technology played in all of this. So in the process of traveling, I would just get into conversations with all kinds of people, and I thought, well, what if I can turn these conversations, I can make them more systematic, and I can write a book out of them. So I decided to travel the world pre-pandemic and strike up conversations with strangers and just do some work to pick them out so that they could be as different from me as possible. And just ask them 3 questions, always the same 3 questions. What is democracy? What does it mean to be a citizen? And what would make democracy better? And so I had these grand plans. I made my list. I had all my notebooks. They were in different colors. I have this whole thing that I do with music and art and colors that inspires me and drives me when I'm working on a project. And I had a list of 100 countries that I wanted to go to, and then a book proposal that I sent to the publisher. And the feedback that I got from reviewer 2, which in academia we joke is always the nasty reviewer, said, well, this is a wonderful proposal. It's great. It's beautiful. It's very broad. It has a lot of potential. It's also very bad. There's too many countries. She should focus on just one country or one city or just a set of cities or just the rural areas. And I didn't want to do that because those books had been written by political scientists much smarter than myself. There's books written about specific countries and also about the rural areas. They had just recently come out. I wanted to just focus on these 3 questions and just really get a snapshot of the world. So I ended up having to, I said, fine, if you don't want me to go 100 countries, I won't go to 100 countries. I ended up narrowing down the list and traveling to Mexico and China, Russia, Greece, Brazil, the UK, US obviously, Canada, and then Germany, and then I also visited refugee centers so that I could have conversations of many places that I wanted to travel to, but it wasn't safe for me to go there, or if I spoke with them, I would end up putting my informants in danger. So this is a sampling of where all of my responses are coming from. And here I'm going to read you some direct quotes from my participants. I asked them what name they wanted to use, and so they either picked a name or they chose their own names or they decided to be anonymous. Just to give you a sense of the depth of these conversations that I had that surprised me, that made my jaw drop, that deeply moved me, especially when I had conversations. I asked people who had just fled their country with just the hairs they were wearing, the clothes they were wearing on their back. I asked those people, what is democracy? So Umair from Pakistan told me that democracy is the obligation to speak up when something is wrong. Hussein from Afghanistan told me that democracy is one thing, politics is a completely different thing. Drew from New York told me that citizenship used to be a privilege, now it's a label. Uzma from Pakistan told me, you elected them, it's your choice. And then, this was a comment on taking civic responsibility seriously, and not, falling for any populist that tells a pretty tale. Protest about the important things, Fiona from Albania. This comes from, this was in response, I think, to the tendency that we often have in the Balkans to protest about everything. But I think it rings true today as well, and in this country in particular. Those who govern us must have an education. Governance is not for everyone. We must raise the standards. We all want to be heard, but we must learn to listen to each other. This was deeply moving. On cover, it's democracy, but it doesn't feel like it. This is Luis from Mexico. This was my first interview in the middle of Mexico City on a very warm day. This was a cab driver. I had all of my approvals from my university to do my research, so it was pretty much like a go or die moment. And I said, okay, go for it. I already had interesting rapport with this particular driver, so I just started talking about my project and had a very fun, informative conversation with him. Must balance emotion with logic to be a good citizen. This is wonderful. That's part of the reason why I wrote Affective Publics. I was very curious as to why we say, you're not thinking with your heart, or you're not acting with your brain. I've always thought that the two work together. I don't understand why we often comment like they're two separate things. And neuroscience actually has very specific things to tell us about how they're intertwined. Democracy depends on what government does with it. An anonymous source from Syria. People often have to choose the least worst option. That's Khalid from Morocco. So this gives you a preview of how people responded to my questions. What did I generally find quickly, without delving into all the different details? People first offer these textbook explanations. They feel like they're being graded. They would start the conversation. They would say, did I get it right? Is this what you wanted? And I would explain, no, there is no correct answer. I just want to understand what your reading is of democracy. And I got some of the wonderful responses that you just got that reflected the cynicism and the sense of disappointment, and the sense that also somehow the governance system is out of sync with the times that we're living in. That it feels, this current version of democracy, never mind where you're experiencing it from, feels dated, and that's part of the reason why it's failing. We've grown out of these established paths of civic participation, and trying to go down them feels like, I say in the book, like trying to fit into the clothes that we wore as teenagers. We want to recreate that feeling, that affect, that mood, that atmosphere, that excitement, but It's impossible. It's, we've already been there. We've lived that. That was a previous version of who we were. We have to come up with something that works for who we are now. When I ask, what does it mean to be a citizen, I get all sorts of noble responses. There's great nobility behind what people want to do great things, and they're not giving me, not in a sort of, societally desirable way. They're not just telling me this because that's what I want to hear. Because there's ways in which, I push and I ask for clarification in my interviews. I didn't meet anyone who didn't have earnest intentions about democracy, no matter what their ideological background was. But what I found was that people were overwhelmed with professional and personal responsibilities. They were saturated with information, saturated with technology, saturated with a number of different demands that they often did not have the time to do all that it takes to be a good citizen. And also, a lot of times, as a result, they felt not seen and not heard. And then when I asked what could be better, people had a hard time telling me what could be better. They were very eager to tell me what was wrong, but they had a hard time sometimes telling me how we might fix it, which got me thinking, especially because they often spoke about this right after explaining how saturated they felt with information. As a society, have we lost the ability to imagine? Have we forgotten what it takes to cultivate the skills to think things over, to reimagine things? And so, pooling these responses together, I came up with 10 suggestions of my own. So there could be more, there could be fewer, that synthesize these responses on things that we might do to make democracy better, but also to advance then to the next stage. And as I introduce them, I want to highlight that what's important is that they're all implemented together. So you can't, work on number 1 and forget about number 10 or number 5. This must all happen in the same manner. And of course, this must also happen in a very gradual manner. So the first thing that came apparent right away is that we need to reverse the trend. We have very strong capitalism, very soft democracy. So we must find a way. Nobody wanted capitalism to go away, but we need to make capitalism softer, give it more of a direct, more of a democratic conscience, more of a democratic directive, more of a commitment, an explicit commitment to support democracy so as to make democracy stronger. And some examples of, gun regulation, the global tax, climate change, these are all examples of softening capitalism. I would also add ways in which larger corporations can contribute to education and educating the public. The second thing is microgovernance. I found that my respondents got most inspired when they would speak about contributions that they made to their communities. Plato famously said that democracy doesn't scale up. Its ideal number of a democracy is 5,000 citizens, and perhaps it's true. It's very difficult for democracy to scale up. We've been trying to scale it up, and we've been getting nothing but problems. So people felt really inspired when they were involved in micro engagement and micro communities. So the second suggestion I make is building off of that. It seems like we have a lot going on the micro and a lot going on the macro level of governance, but very little connecting those two together, very little on the meso. That's the complaint that, people are not being seen, they're not being heard. So let's cultivate a whole new line of professions of, conduits and interlocutors and people who are trained to support democracy scaling up through technology, curators and mediators and algorithm auditors and conflict resolvers and conversation facilitators and propellers and democratic etiquette savants who can help us then take the sort of wonderful things that we're doing on the micro community level and communicate them, use them to build bridges to other micro communities and feel more connected also to our forms of government and governance. Counting absence, this is the riskiest recommendation that I make. We can't disregard absence. I think we've just sort of, been ignoring it and explaining it away as apathy, and that's not what it is at all. It's not people who are apathetic. Those are people that politicians did not manage to motivate enough to get them to the voting booth. It's hard to think of voter suppression working if not getting people motivated enough to vote again for you is counting against you. Perhaps come up with some way of charging demerit points on politicians for not getting people to the voting booth. At the same time, further down, I talk about forgetting messiahs. That's why I'm emphasizing that we need all of these things to happen together, not just one at a time. At the same time, we have to do this in a manner that doesn't pave the way for people to then, lure voters to the voting booth through just false promises. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I'm trying to point out is that, in most democracies, 50%, if not less, of the population votes. It's very difficult to support the argument that the results of those elections have legitimacy. In fact, we often criticize other governments that have similar, that find themselves in a similar situation as being non-democratic. Long and short-term politics. This is a very easy idea to explain. This is something that we do in our everyday lives, in our work lives, in our family planning, in our everyday routines. We distinguish between the short term and the long term. We somehow, and there's a lot of different people in our workplaces and a lot of different people in our families, but we somehow find a way to agree on what's important in the long term and to stick to that promise. And then also to decide on what's important, a priority for the short term, and work on that. Making that distinction and calling politicians to make that distinction when they run for office, to commit to some long-term goals, and then to also be more than, and then in that case, have the freedom to be a little bit more detailed in terms of how they're going to go about accomplishing short-term goals. Beyond voting, offering pathways for civic engagement that extend beyond just, every 4 or 5 years going to the voting booth. It makes citizens feel like, people are just remembering they're around just when they need their vote. It makes them feel not seen, not heard, just counted as votes. As civic education for all, when I speak about this, people often ask, well, aren't most government official educated? Some are very well, some not. But what I'm referring to here is cultivating a democratic conscience, a democratic etiquette, understanding across democracies, up and down the hierarchy, what the democratic canon is, what is the democratic grammar, the syntax, how do we speak? How do we speak democracy? How do we talk in democratic societies? What's the tonality? What's the right thing to say when we want to express our viewpoint in a respectful manner, in a civically responsible manner? Democracy is not ultimate freedom, or the freedom to do whatever we want to say, or the freedom to do whatever we want or say whatever we want to say in any way we want to say it. It is about respecting the freedom of others and the greater good. I was watching this new show that Jon Stewart was doing the other day that's called The Problem, and he had a person who had left Egypt because of some of the regime changes, and another person who had fled Venezuela, and then of course a person who was a journalist who was waiting to be tried in the Philippines. And all three of them said, freedom is not free. No, democracy is about that. Forgetting messiahs, I think it's one of my favorite ones to talk about. Dictators or populists often present as people who will save you from your misery. No one can save you except for yourself. So let's learn to distrust them in our personal lives, in the choices that we make, but also in our civic choices as well. Let's cultivate that kind of literacy. Let's be repulsed by anybody who presents as a messiah. Gaming the system. News, media, headlines, clickbaits, the economics of attention, every little bit counts. Let's use our gaze in a very strategic manner. We give things importance simply by looking at them, by directing our gaze at them. So if something is not interesting, not important, doesn't merit our attention, let's make it a point to turn our gaze away and turn our gaze or our ears to things that we care about. Let's begin sending the right message, communicating the right message about what news coverage it is that we want to see so that the media start listening. Reinventing journalism, there's a lot I can say about this. I am a journalism school PhD after all, and I've written extensively about this, but I will say something that I've been saying for a while. Somewhere along the line, journalists in the US got the wrong idea about what objectivity is. And they got to thinking that, objectivity means, telling both sides of the story, which is not the case. Not every story has two sides. There's some stories that just have one side. Take this pandemic and the need for being vaccinated, for instance. That's just one side to that. There are a lot of other stories that have more than two sides. They have multiple different sides. So it's not just a question, of taking the microphone or the platform and providing access to everyone who has a thing to say, a point of view. And here I think journalists can first work much more closely with science and help us scientists communicate with publics better, more accurately. Our job as scientists is to research the truth, to find the truth, and we could sure use the help of journalists in terms of communicating and conveying that truth to the public. But I think journalists can also learn from us, scientists, in terms of how we approach objectivity. And as scientists, here's how we're trained to approach objectivity. We're never told that we have to tell both sides of the story, not at all. The first thing we're trained to do is acknowledge our own subjectivity, acknowledge our own bias. And then we can find ways to make our subjectivity part of the research, part of the story, to use it to help us get better research out. Or we're trained to control it, to keep it in check. There's many different strategies, but it definitely doesn't involve getting everyone, just taking the microphone and just passing it around across the room. And finally, let's be our own agents of civic change. Let's be civic adults. Again, as I've been saying so often, let's forget about this dream that we keep wanting to have, or, this habits that we thought we had in the past that worked perfect, but they never really did. Let's own our situation, our present, and rise up to it, rise up to the challenge. Let's be adults, find a democracy that fits us. Life is not static, neither is democracy. And so here I want to leave you. This is a painting by Wilfredo Lam that's called Enigmatic Jungle, and in some ways it reminds me of some of the conversations that I had as I was trying to decipher and find the patterns in the enigmatic jungle of data that I was trying to interpret. So these are some quotes from the book, things that I wrote as I was trying to put the whole experience into words. So, perhaps democracy is constantly about disorder and tumult and does not necessarily provide a way out of these conditions. It's about silence, noise, and constant ambivalence at the same time. What I call democracy's fugitive soul, or democracy always being on the run. Also, democracy is not a boxing match. It's not about having debates and deciding who's the winner and who's the loser. There are no winners and losers. There is consensus, and that's the driver of democracy that came very clearly across through my conversations. Silence is also an opinion. It is a political stance. When we're silent, there's a reason usually behind it that needs to be read, that needs to be investigated. The absence of opinion is, in fact, an expression of a political position. It communicates a variety of different things, including, not limited to, refusal, discontent, indignation, and indecision. In some ways, silence can be as important as voice. A mix of nostalgia and aspiration lies beneath our collective imaginings of what might be. One of the first books I read when I started doing this project was called The Future of Nostalgia. So, we're unwittingly romanced by the trappings of the past. We look at the future with the feeling that there was something better that preceded it, something that was somehow lost. And then I talk with people who have very lively personalities, very lively imaginations, and yet they're called to participate through civic paths that are very formulaic. Go vote on a Tuesday, leave work, stand in line, dry and boring. Let's reject the things that we're not happy with. Let's refuse to order and consume from a menu of civic options that was not created for us, was not created by us. Let's evolve out of these binaries, these referenda that call for a yes or no response to an answer that can be to a question that can be very complicated. And think, while we're on the topic, how many questions that you're presented with daily can you answer with a yes or no? Just try to think. What do you want to eat? Are you hungry? Are you sleepy? It's very simple things. Very few things have such a simple answer, and definitely not, complicated civic decisions. Let's evolve out of these binaries and exist in the words of Jean Cocteau, in the center extreme. We look for politicians who are trustworthy and reliable, but we do not realize that the media operate in ways that often require people to play a part in order to appear to be themselves. I think sometimes we need to be very suspicious of someone who very easily presents as authentic on TV. Again, think of yourselves. Is a TV screen presenting in front of a Zoom screen, does that feel like your natural habitat, the place where you're at your most authentic? Why are we judging politicians based on their ability to appear authentic in a very directed, manufactured setting of, let's say, a televised debate? And citizens, in an attention economy, your attention is a powerful commodity. It's your path to agency. Choose how you focus your attention. Again, use the gaze wisely. Don't squander your attention to clickbait headlines. Play hard to get. Our attention is our power in an information economy. And this you've heard me say before. Let's stop trying to get into these habits that were designed for times different than our own. Let's be civic adults. Let's find a democracy that's right for our times, and then let's try to cultivate, to regrow the power of imagination. Let's use technology to help us do that. Technologies, I like to say, network us, but it is our stories that connect us, that identify us, and that also potentially divide us. So let's find ways to use technologies to tell the stories that connect us, but let's not lose sight of those things that divide us. Let's use technology to build bridges. You know, bridge is a magical thing. You use it to cross the river, but at the same time, you're looking at the river. You're looking at what is separating you. You're not forgetting that. So let's use technology to create those bridges, but also to help us remember the past as well as imagine the future. Thank you.